What if a single woman, cornered by betrayal, could turn an entire kingdom into her personal instrument of punishment? That question haunts every chronicle that tried to erase her, because the truth is far darker than the legends. Her rise was not born from madness, but from precision, calculation, and a vow whispered on the night her closest rival tried to poison her. The court expected her to die quietly, another footnote in a palace where ambition devoured the weak. They never imagined she would survive, and they certainly never imagined what she would become. Even now, historians struggle to explain how she transformed from a political pawn into a force that reshaped the balance of power across half a continent. Some say her vengeance began in the Great Hall, moments after the poison failed. Others claim the transformation started earlier, the first time she saw the court smile while pretending to mourn a princess whose death they had orchestrated. But when you trace the surviving fragments of her life, a clearer pattern emerges. She learned early that power in ancient courts was a weapon carved from silence. Whoever mastered silence controlled fear, and whoever controlled fear controlled everything. That is why the Bloody Queen never struck quickly. She struck patiently, creating loops of uncertainty that forced her rivals to turn on each other long before she laid a hand on any of them. She made them believe the danger was everywhere, except where it truly was. Her first tactic was unsettlingly simple. She began collecting fragments of secrets, whispered confessions from servants, overlooked notes from scribes, coded messages exchanged between noble families. She never confronted anyone with these secrets. She merely hinted that she knew more than she should. The effect was immediate. Rivals who once plotted together began avoiding each other. Alliances cracked, rumors multiplied, and through it all she appeared calm, almost fragile, as if untouched by the chaos tightening around the court. But beneath that quiet exterior lived a mind reshaping the very architecture of fear. Every week, something small shifted. A noblewoman would find her private chamber disturbed, but nothing stolen. Another would discover a servant dismissed without explanation. Another would receive an anonymous warning written in her own handwriting. None of these events caused harm on their own, but together they built an atmosphere so suffocating that rivals began imagining threats that did not exist. That was her brilliance. She weaponized imagination. She understood that fear is most destructive when it has no visible source. And by the time the court realized she was behind it all, the psychological damage was irreversible. You might think this strategy was excessive, but consider the world she lived in. Betrayal was currency. Poison was etiquette. Smiling enemies sat closer than friends. If she hesitated for even a moment, she would have been swallowed whole. Everything she did was calculated for survival, and survival became the foundation of her wrath. What you are about to uncover is not simply a tale of cruelty, but a blueprint of how a forgotten queen rewrote the rules of power by using methods so subtle they almost vanished from the historical record. You already feel it, the tension between what she endured and what she chose to become. And before we continue, tell me something. Have you ever watched someone change under pressure until you barely recognized them? Stories like this reveal why understanding these transformations matters. If this opening is already shifting how you see power, leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Make sure you hit like to help this content reach more people, and check whether you are subscribed so you do not miss the next revelations. Because what you will discover next might surprise you, and this story is only beginning to uncover what her rivals truly feared. She had already fractured the court's unity, but the Bloody Queen knew that true revenge required precision. The women who dared to challenge her were not ordinary rivals. They were daughters of generals, priestesses ligadas ao antigo culto lunar, conselheiras capazes de manipular exércitos inteiros without lifting a blade. Each one carried influence that could ignite rebellion if provoked abertamente. That is why the queen chose a path far more devastating. She decided to study them, Not their alliances, but their fears, their hidden rituals, their private weaknesses. And the deeper she looked, the more she realized that the palace was built on a labyrinth of unspoken tensions that no king had ever noticed. Only the women of the court understood its true architecture because only they played the invisible games that shaped the balance of power. One rivalry in particular stood out. A noblewoman known for her beauty and for the way she controlled musicians, servants, and even foreign emissaries with nothing more than a composed smile. She walked through the palace como se fosse feita de luz, mas por trás daquela imagem havia algo muito mais calculado. Rumor has it she had been the first to suggest replacing the queen with a more pliable figure. She underestimated two things. First, the queen's ability to read intentions hidden beneath layers of etiquette. Second, the silent loyalty the queen had already begun cultivating among women who felt crushed by the court's cruelty. Those forgotten voices would soon become her most effective spies. The queen began withdrawing from public events. Not enough to raise suspicion, but enough to make her absence meaningful. People fear what they cannot observe. While rivals attended ceremonies, she walked through the palace at dawn, mapping routes servants used, identifying chambers with thin walls, and listening to confessions whispered in the darkness. Every detail became a thread in the web she was weaving. And as she wove, she discovered something extraordinary. The rival noblewomen did not trust one another. Their alliances were superficial, built on vanity and shared ambition, not loyalty. The queen realized she did not need to destroy them. She simply needed to let them destroy themselves. So she planted a single idea, subtle and poisonous enough to take root on its own. A rumor that someone among them had betrayed the group and begun negotiating with the queen. No names, no details. Just a seed of doubt. And within days, the palace shifted. Conversations became colder. Doors locked earlier. Gifts were refused. One by one, the powerful women of the court began isolating themselves in an attempt to appear innocent. But isolation was exactly what the queen needed, because isolated rivals lose strength. They lose perspective. They make mistakes they would never make surrounded by allies. Her greatest advantage, however, was the palace staff. Most nobles saw servants as invisible. The queen saw them as the pulse of the kingdom. Through them, she learned who cried in secret, who tore letters before burning them, who carried symbols of forbidden cults beneath their garments. She knew which women feared abandonment, which feared exposure, and which feared the queen herself. These fears became the silent weapons she deployed to push them into conflict. Each step was calculated with the precision of a strategist preparing a battlefield, except her battlefield was psychological, and her enemies were unaware they were already fighting. By the time the court realized something profound was shifting, it was already too late. The queen had turned the palace into an arena where every rival walked believing she might be the next target. Yet none of them understood that the true danger was not the queen's wrath. It was her patience. Because while they scrambled to protect their status, she was preparing something far more devastating than simple retaliation. A plan that would make the court tremble long before a single punishment was delivered, and that would expose just how fragile their power truly was, even at the height of their influence. The queen's strategy was not merely about fear, it was about control, invisibly orchestrated. She began exploiting the unspoken rules that governed the court, those delicate threads of etiquette, jealousy, and ambition that had been ignored for decades. Every gesture, every whispered comment, every glance in the hall was now part of her calculation. She would not strike with swords or poison immediately. Those were the tools of the reckless. She used influence, misinformation, and subtle intimidation as instruments far more precise. Her rivals, blinded by their own pride, never realized that each misstep, every moment of hesitation, was being recorded in the queen's mind like a ledger of vulnerabilities. One evening, The queen invited her rivals to a council meeting under the pretense of reconciliation. The grand hall was lit with hundreds of candles, their flickering light reflecting in the polished floors, and shadows danced across the high vaulted ceilings. The rivals, unaware of the trap, spoke freely about alliances, strategies, and ambitions. Every word they believed was private was now weaponized. The queen listened patiently, nodding, her face serene, almost tender. She let them speak, revealing their plans, exposing weaknesses, and confirming suspicions they didn't even know existed. When the rivals left, the seeds of discord were planted irreversibly, and their alliances began to crumble without a single overt confrontation. Meanwhile, the queen cultivated a network of informants within the palace. Servants, courtiers, and even foreign emissaries became unwitting collaborators. A dropped note here, a whispered secret there, all funneled back to her, giving her insight into intentions, fears, and ambitions that no one dared openly admit. She transformed the palace into a theater of psychological warfare, and, the actors, her rivals, were entirely unaware that the stage had been built long before they ever entered it. By controlling the flow of information, she dictated perceptions, shaped reactions, and managed reputations, leaving her enemies guessing, uncertain of whom to trust, and increasingly isolated. The queen's brilliance lay in her ability to combine subtle manipulation with patience. Rivals who believed they were maneuvering for advantage were actually playing into her hands. She exploited vanity, greed, and fear, crafting scenarios where each rival's decisions led to self-sabotage. A whispered rumor might inspire paranoia. A minor betrayal could ignite a feud. A carefully timed compliment or slight could provoke jealousy, sparking conflict within their own circles. Every move was anticipated, every reaction predicted, and every outcome carefully calculated to advance her position without revealing her own hand. By the time the court realized they were ensnared, it was too late. Conflicts had escalated internally, mistrust poisoned friendships, and the palace was suffused with tension. The queen had created a perfect storm of psychological instability, where fear and uncertainty governed every interaction. She didn't need to raise a hand. Her enemies were dismantling themselves, their power eroded from within. It was the ultimate form of control. Absolute dominance achieved not through violence, but through strategy, foresight, and the relentless application of insight into human nature. The rituals she employed were as mysterious as they were terrifying, blending superstition, occult practice, and political theater into an arsenal of control that few could understand. Within the private chambers of the palace, she orchestrated ceremonies that appeared benign at first glance, tea gatherings, night observances, or meditation sessions. But each was meticulously designed to unsettle, to condition, and to enforce obedience. Candles were placed at precise angles to cast shadows that resembled spectral figures. Mirrors reflected images that hinted at hidden observers, and subtle scents filled the air, triggering memories or fears long buried in the subconscious minds of her rivals. Every element was intentional, every detail a layer of psychological pressure calculated to wear down resistance without ever spilling blood openly. One of her most effective rituals involved the exchange of symbolic gifts, each selected to represent vulnerability or betrayal. A jewel might be given with a hidden mark only visible in candlelight, a letter of condolence subtly insinuating doubt about loyalty, a cup of wine flavored with herbs that provoked unease or heightened anxiety. These were not mere tokens, they were instruments of manipulation, forcing the recipients to question themselves, their alliances, and even their sanity. Over time, such rituals created a climate of paranoia where rivals acted irrationally, trusting neither their own judgment nor the intentions of those around them. The queen's enemies became prisoners of perception, ensnared by invisible chains forged from fear and suggestion. The queen's rituals extended beyond the personal sphere into the public domain. She staged events that combined spectacle with subtle threats, turning the entire court into a stage where observers could never be sure if they were witnesses to celebration or a warning of impending ruin. Servants whispered instructions, musicians played melodies that carried coded messages, and courtiers participated unwittingly in dramas that reinforced her supremacy. Each gathering reinforced the illusion that her power was limitless, that dissent was not only dangerous, but almost impossible. Even small errors in decorum or etiquette were magnified, leaving rivals exposed and anxious, unsure whether missteps would result in social ruin, exile, or something far worse. Underlying these rituals was a deep understanding of human psychology. The queen knew that fear, when combined with uncertainty, was more potent than direct confrontation. By controlling perceptions and manipulating the subtle rhythms of court life, she amplified anxieties and divided allegiances without ever lifting a blade. Her power was absolute precisely because it was invisible, operating in the shadows of perception and imagination. The court's social fabric, carefully maintained for generations, unraveled under her influence as rivals fought phantom threats and imagined betrayals, each action feeding into the queen's web of dominance. And yet the queen did not appear malevolent on the surface. To outsiders, she seemed graceful, composed, even benevolent. That calm exterior was part of the ritual itself, a psychological anchor that reinforced her control. Rivals could never predict when they were safe, when the next manipulation would occur, or which event was real and which was a carefully orchestrated illusion. The uncertainty became the weapon. Over months, sometimes years, the rituals conditioned the court to respond precisely as she intended, ensuring that when the moment of overt vengeance arrived, her rivals were already weakened, fragmented, and unable to resist. The banquet was announced as a celebration of alliances, a gathering of the most influential figures in the kingdom, but beneath the gilded tablecloths and crystal goblets, a trap had been meticulously arranged. Every chair, every place setting, every servant's step was orchestrated to amplify tension and anticipation. The queen knew that the mere presence of her rivals in a confined space, surrounded by opulence and subtle cues of surveillance, would heighten anxiety and reveal cracks in their composure. As they entered, their eyes swept over the table, noting the precise arrangement of foods, the placement of silverware, the faces of attendees carefully seated to maximize exposure to observation. The queen remained seated at the head, serene, yet every gesture she made carried the weight of strategy and silent threat. During the banquet, conversation was both encouraged and subtly guided. Discussions of politics, loyalty, and past decisions were steered to expose hesitations, inconsistencies, and hidden ambitions. A smile at the wrong moment, a glance exchanged between rivals, a subtle shift in posture. Each became a data point the queen observed with meticulous attention. She had trained herself to read minute expressions, the fleeting quiver of a hand, the barely audible intonation in a voice, and she cataloged them all mentally. By the third course, tension was palpable. Rivals shifted uneasily, sensing the weight of scrutiny, but unsure of what exactly they were being measured against. The true cunning of the banquet lay in its rituals and hidden cues. Candles flickered in patterns that cast shadows resembling the specters of past betrayals. Music was played with deliberate irregularity, creating subconscious dissonance and unease. Even the arrangement of plates and goblets subtly reinforced hierarchy and dominance, reminding each rival of their vulnerability and of the queen's supremacy. When messages were discreetly delivered via passing servants, letters, symbols, or whispered words, they served as reminders that the queen knew more than she had revealed, that she was already several moves ahead in the unseen game unfolding around the table. The psychological impact of the banquet was profound. Rivals left physically unharmed, but mentally unsettled, their confidence eroded, and their alliances weakened. Every conversation replayed in their minds, every subtle cue analyzed obsessively, creating internal conflict and self-doubt. The queen did not need swords or poison here. The terror was crafted from observation, anticipation, and the relentless erosion of certainty. By the time the evening ended, her rivals were already playing into her larger strategy, their own fears and suspicions driving them to act in ways that ultimately served her purposes. This event became a turning point in the Queen's campaign of dominance. The banquet demonstrated how power could be exercised invisibly, how fear and uncertainty could be weaponized against those who considered themselves untouchable. She had transformed a social ritual into a theater of control, ensuring that her enemies were compromised before any overt act of vengeance was required. And while the court would speak of the evening as a grand celebration for generations, only the queen understood the depth of its design and the precision with which it had begun to dismantle her rivals from within. The stage is set for what comes next. The seeds of doubt and fear sown at the banquet will bloom into irreversible consequences. And the queen's ultimate plan, far more brutal than mere rumors suggest, is poised to unfold in ways that will leave the court trembling. The queen's vengeance now moved beyond whispers and rituals. Physical punishment, though, carefully concealed, began to claim her rivals one by one. These were not public executions meant to inspire fear openly. They were invisible, precise, and designed to erase without spectacle. Noblewomen who had dared to challenge her found themselves summoned to private chambers, only to disappear without explanation. Some were escorted under the guise of counsel or negotiation. Others were never seen leaving their apartments. No guards were found, no formal charges recorded. The court whispered about mysterious absences, blaming illness, travel, or divine misfortune. But the queen's hand was behind every vanishing. The method was psychological as much as it was physical. Those who remained lived in constant anticipation, their thoughts consumed with what might happen next. Every letter opened could reveal a threat. Every servant glance was a potential warning. Each rival's imagination became her instrument, amplifying fear until it was almost unbearable. The court learned that fear of the unknown, when expertly manipulated, could be more destructive than the threat itself. And while the queen's enemies speculated about the fate of their missing peers, she quietly ensured that their influence, alliances, and secrets were absorbed into her control, eliminating opposition without drawing attention to herself. Every disappearance was followed by subtle reinforcement of authority. A servant might mention a cryptic warning casually in passing. A rival's chamber could be found rearranged or disturbed, and murmurs of previous rivals' fates would circulate. These actions kept everyone guessing, undermining trust and cohesion among her adversaries. Isolation intensified paranoia, and paranoia became a silent executioner. Her rivals were undone not by the sword, but by their own anxiety, their own fear of what might befall them next. In effect, the queen weaponized the invisible, turning uncertainty into a tool as sharp as any blade. Even the most powerful among her rivals could not counteract this strategy. Attempts at alliance or rebellion were thwarted by the queen's mastery of perception. Mistrust was sown subtly, creating fractures in relationships that had previously seemed unbreakable. Letters were intercepted or altered, confidences twisted into evidence of disloyalty, and the palace staff, loyal to the queen, ensured that every move was observed and reported. By the time her enemies realized the scope of her strategy, the outcomes were already inevitable. The web of fear, secrecy, and invisible influence had done its work, leaving the queen unchallenged, her rivals diminished, and her dominion strengthened. Her execution of rivals without leaving evidence became legendary within the court, though few dared to speak of it. These invisible eliminations reinforced her mystique, making her seem almost omnipotent. She had turned the very structure of the palace, the flow of information, and the psychology of her adversaries into instruments of power. Even today, historians struggle to piece together the full extent of her methods, because so much was deliberately concealed, leaving only traces in fragmented correspondence, anecdotal accounts, and whispered rumors. It was a form of mastery rarely documented, and even rarer understood. The consequences were as psychological as they were strategic. The remaining women of the court began to fracture internally, their ambitions curtailed by constant fear, their alliances unstable, their decisions influenced more by anxiety than strategy. By removing her rivals silently, the queen not only preserved her image but ensured that no uprising could gather momentum. And while the court continued its functions, behind the ornate doors, invisible justice was being executed with terrifying precision. The queen's reach extended beyond the palace walls, into hidden networks of influence and secrecy. Among these were the women of the North, a clandestine sect whose knowledge of rituals, poisons, and clandestine intelligence rivaled any royal advisor. While the court whispered of omens and magic, the queen cultivated their loyalty with care, blending mutual benefit and shared ambition into an unbreakable bond. Their allegiance was not granted lightly. Initiation into the sect involved trials that tested courage, cunning, and absolute discretion. Those who passed became her eyes, her ears, and sometimes her hands, acting invisibly to enforce her will across the kingdom. Through this alliance, the queen gained access to intelligence that no courtier could provide. Letters intercepted en route, secret alliances uncovered, rival plots dismantled before they matured. All were made possible by the northern women who moved like shadows, unseen yet omnipresent. The queen used this network not just for surveillance, but to extend the reach of her psychological strategies. A whispered warning here, a seemingly accidental encounter there, and her rivals would feel the weight of observation even when no one appeared to watch. Fear multiplied, because uncertainty thrives when the source is invisible, and the northern sect ensured that the queen's presence was felt everywhere and nowhere at once. This alliance also allowed the queen to conduct rituals that amplified her aura of invincibility. They coordinated ceremonies that fused superstition, rumor, and theater, creating events where rivals could be observed, tested, and subtly coerced. A noblewoman, arriving for a diplomatic reception, might find symbols etched in the hall that suggested surveillance or hidden scrutiny. An intercepted letter might hint at betrayal among her own allies. All of this was carefully orchestrated to fracture trust and sow internal conflict, reinforcing the queen's dominance without overt violence. By manipulating perception, she turned the very fear of consequence into a self-fulfilling mechanism of control. But the relationship with the sect was not merely utilitarian. There was a psychological dimension that strengthened the queen's position. Each member of the sect owed loyalty not just to her crown, but to her vision, her strategy, and the promise of shared power. This bond created a feedback loop of reinforcement. As her rivals weakened through paranoia and rivalry, the sect's influence expanded, giving the queen even more intelligence and leverage. She was no longer constrained by conventional court politics. Her dominion extended into the hidden, the unseen, and the unknowable, creating a layer of authority that few could contest. The northern women also provided the queen with contingency plans for every possible threat, including plots from within her own court. By combining their knowledge of secret passages, clandestine communications, and psychological manipulation, the queen could neutralize insurrections before they were even conceived. The palace, though outwardly ceremonial and predictable, had become a labyrinth of hidden oversight, where every rival's action was measured, recorded, and interpreted. And with every calculated move, the queen's reputation grew, both feared and enigmatic, reinforcing the psychological dominance that ensured her vengeance would be total, yet invisible. At the end of these secret alliances, a question lingered in the minds of those who survived. Who truly held power, the queen or the unseen network she commanded? And while that question remained unanswered for most, her rivals already knew the consequence of dissent, disappearance, humiliation, or worse. The Queen's mastery of power was most evident within her own council, a body composed of influential women whose counsel shaped the governance of the kingdom. While the court viewed them as allies or advisors, the Queen treated them as both instruments and potential threats. She understood that internal dissent, if left unchecked, could unravel her carefully woven network of influence. To prevent this, she implemented a strategy that combined subtle intimidation, psychological manipulation, and covert operations. The council became an arena where loyalty was tested daily, and failure to demonstrate absolute fidelity carried consequences far beyond social embarrassment. At first, her tactics were understated. A counselor might find her proposals quietly undermined in committee discussions, or her recommendations misrepresented to other members of the court. Small discrepancies, easily dismissed by the casual observer, were part of a deliberate pattern, eroding confidence and isolating individuals from their peers. The Queen observed with precision, noting which members sought alliances and which operated independently. Those who displayed ambition or defiance were subtly nudged into errors, their decisions manipulated to highlight weaknesses. By the time a rival recognized the manipulation, it was too late. The seeds of mistrust had already taken root, dividing the council from within. The Queen also employed covert agents to infiltrate her own advisory body. Trusted servants, spies posing as clerks, and even members of her inner court secretly reported behaviors, conversations, and alliances. Every meeting, every private discussion, every hesitation was documented mentally and sometimes physically, giving the Queen a comprehensive map of influence and vulnerability. This intelligence allowed her to anticipate challenges before they arose, preempting opposition with surgical precision. Counselors who might have banded together against her were subtly pitted against each other, their ambitions and insecurities exploited until collaboration became impossible. In addition, the Queen manipulated perception and reputation as weapons. A misinterpreted glance, a carefully chosen phrase, or a fabricated rumor could cast doubt on a counselor's loyalty. Others would distance themselves, fearful of being associated with someone under suspicion. The psychological toll was immense. Even the most formidable members of the council found themselves questioning decisions, doubting allies, and fearing invisible repercussions. Every action, every hesitation, every misstep fed into the Queen's larger strategy of dominance without overt aggression. She turned fear into a tool of governance, ensuring that compliance was both voluntary and self-reinforcing. By the time open confrontation would have been necessary, the internal structure of the council was already weakened. Members were disunited, isolated, and operating under constant stress and suspicion. They were effectively neutralized, not through violence or formal censure, but through psychological mastery. The Queen's internal siege had achieved what armies could not. She had dismantled her most immediate threats, ensuring that the heart of her administration was entirely under her control. Through foresight, patience, and manipulation, she proved that the most effective conquest is often not over enemies in the field, but over those closest to power. As the Queen's campaign of subtle terror and manipulation continued, the remaining rivals found themselves cornered in ways they could scarcely comprehend. Her previous tactics, secret disappearances, psychological conditioning, and internal sabotage, had left them fractured, isolated, and weakened. No longer capable of coordinated opposition, they were forced to navigate a court where every action was scrutinized, every alliance questioned, and every word potentially weaponized against them. The Queen had not only eliminated threats physically and strategically, but she had also undermined the very confidence and self-perception of her enemies, creating an internalized fear more powerful than any external threat. The psychological cost to her rivals was devastating. Paranoia became routine. Sleepless nights filled with anxious calculations, imagining betrayals at every turn. Their own ambitions and talents became liabilities, exposing them to subtle traps and misdirections orchestrated by the queen. Courtiers began second-guessing not just their peers, but themselves, wondering whether they had already failed without realizing it. Even those who survived the queen's maneuvers emerged fundamentally changed, carrying a weight of fear and mistrust that would shadow them for the rest of their lives. The queen's power, therefore, was measured not just in who remained alive, but in how deeply her influence had penetrated the minds of her adversaries. Meanwhile, the queen maintained a carefully cultivated appearance of benevolence and decorum, masking the true extent of her dominance. Outsiders observing the court saw elegance, ceremony, and proper governance, never realizing that the underlying reality was one of fear-driven compliance. By projecting normalcy, she prevented alliances from forming among potential enemies, for any move to challenge her would appear foolhardy or misguided. The threat she posed was omnipresent yet invisible, a constant pressure that forced rivals into errors and self-sabotage without ever needing to act overtly. The residual power of the queen's reign extended beyond mere survival or political supremacy. Her methods left a lingering psychological imprint on the court, ensuring that even those who survived were irrevocably shaped by her influence. Fear became internalized, rivalries intensified, and loyalties were redefined according to her design. The queen's strategy demonstrated that true power often lies not in overt acts of violence or authority, but in the manipulation of perception, trust, and belief, turning human psychology into a weapon more effective than any army or decree. By mastering the minds of her enemies, she created a lasting legacy of dominance that persisted even after individual adversaries had been neutralized. The culmination of her calculated reign of blood set the stage for the final consolidation of her influence, revealing just how far-reaching her control could extend. She had eliminated opposition without visible spectacle, reshaping the court's power dynamic so thoroughly that no rival could anticipate her next move. Her mastery over fear, perception, and internal politics ensured that her enemies were as much prisoners of their own minds as of her strategy. And as the court trembled under the weight of these unseen forces, the queen's position remained unchallenged, her authority absolute, and her vengeance complete. The reign of the Bloody Queen did not end with the fall or disappearance of her rivals. Her influence, carefully sown through fear, manipulation, and psychological precision, left enduring traces that outlived the individuals she targeted. While historians recorded victories, alliances, and political shifts, few documented the subtle, pervasive impact of her strategies. The court she controlled became a blueprint of terror, an invisible architecture of dominance that shaped behavior, thought, and loyalty for generations. Those who survived carried the imprint of her control, their actions constrained by memories of the invisible executions, the orchestrated rituals, and the silent, omnipresent observation that defined her rule. Her legacy is found not only in historical texts, but also in the cultural memory of the court. Tales of disappearances, unexplained punishments, and whispered warnings became cautionary legends, reinforcing obedience without the queen ever raising a hand. She demonstrated that power can be absolute when it is exercised in ways unseen, when fear is administered subtly, and when the mind of the adversary becomes the ultimate battlefield. Through patience, intelligence, and a mastery of human psychology, she ensured that her authority would endure beyond her lifetime, leaving a kingdom structured not merely by law or hierarchy, but by the invisible chains of influence she had forged. Even centuries later, traces of her methods echo in the ways courts and governments have managed internal rivalries. The principles she applied, control perception, manipulate fear, exploit uncertainty, isolate threats, remain relevant in understanding the dynamics of power and the fragility of human confidence under pressure. Scholars who uncover her correspondences, court records, and fragmented memoirs recognize a pattern that is both horrifying and instructive. The greatest dominion is achieved not by brute force alone, but by mastering the hearts and minds of those who might oppose you. In this sense, her reign serves as a case study in psychological warfare, an example of strategic cruelty, and a testament to the enduring power of cunning and patience. Her story also challenges conventional notions of legacy and memory. While monuments, decrees, and formal records often celebrate kings, generals, or battles, the bloody queen's triumph lies in what was invisible: the silenced voices, the dismantled networks of influence, and the psychological transformation of her adversaries. These are the marks her terror left on history, subtle, pervasive, and enduring. To understand her fully, one must look beyond the surface of power and examine the ways she reshaped loyalty, fear, and obedience in the shadows, crafting a domain where her presence was always felt, yet rarely seen. And now, for those who have followed her story to this point, consider the implications. Power can be absolute, not only through action, but through perception, strategy, and psychological mastery. If you've been captivated by how she dismantled rivals, manipulated fear, and created invisible dominion, take a moment to leave a comment with the phrase, "I've seen the shadows," like this video, and make sure you are subscribed to explore more accounts of hidden history. There are further stories waiting that will reveal the strategies, secrets, and sinister genius of historical figures whose power extended beyond what any eye could witness. The court may have forgotten them, but through this exploration, their influence lives on, ready to teach lessons about fear, strategy, and control.